can open this in a separate window. Ouch, Chunkers. What's out, buddy? Chunkers. Forget about it. Let's go on YouTube. What do we want to watch? Oh, 75%, okay.
Hello everyone, and welcome to another collection of Horrible Fates. The stories in today's videos are some of the saddest, weirdest, and most horrifying circumstances that people in history have ever encountered.
Okay.
As always, viewer discretion is advised. Henry Gunther was born on June 6, 1895, into a German-American family in Baltimore, Maryland. His parents were both children of German immigrants, so he was a second-generation American that still had strong cultural ties to his German ancestry. After graduating high school, he became a bookkeeper and a clerk at the National Bank of Baltimore, and by the time he was in his early 20s, he had a pretty great life. He had a good job, a nice house, and he had even recently gotten engaged to his beautiful girlfriend. At the same time, however, Europe was engaged in the brutal conflict World War I. Initially, it seemed like this wouldn't impact the United States, but then in April of 1917, the US declared war on Germany. This was for several reasons, but the main one often cited is Germany's decision to attack merchant and passenger ships. Initially as well, it was by volunteer only, so Henry made the decision not to enlist because of his strong German family ties. Unfortunately, realizing that the US military needed far more troops than would volunteer, President Woodrow Wilson began conscripting men ages 21 to 30. So despite Henry's effort to stay out of the war, in September of 1917, he was drafted into the army. Henry was initially assigned to the 313th Infantry Regiment as a private, but was quickly promoted to supply sergeant after only a couple of months because of his work ethic. His unit was moved to France in July of 1918, and while he was in France, one of the letters he had written to send home was intercepted by the Army Postal Censor. Now, another thing that occurred in 1917 was the passing of something called the Espionage Act. This gave postal officials the authority to ban newspapers and magazines from mail and threatened individuals who obstructed the draft with $10,000 fines and up to 20 years in jail. Then in 1918, the Sedition Act was passed, making it a federal offense to use disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the Constitution, government, American uniform, or the flag. Over 2,100 Americans would later be prosecuted for offenses under those two pieces of legislation. Unfortunately for Henry, the letter he had written was to a friend, and in it he was expressing his frustration with the conditions in the trenches. He had also strongly encouraged his friend not to enlist and try to avoid getting drafted if possible. This was seen as not only an attempt to obstruct the draft, but also disloyal to the cause, prompting military command to discipline Henry by demoting him back down to private. In addition to this public demotion down several ranks, this behavior was considered highly shameful and dishonorable. This was made worse by Henry's German heritage, further raising suspicions about his loyalties. And as if things couldn't get any worse, his fiancée even broke off the engagement following his embarrassing demotion down to private. But the worst part about all of this was that this was clearly a misunderstanding. Despite Henry's heritage and his feelings about the war itself, he was a hard-working and devoted soldier anyway. It was for that reason that he was promoted in the first place. So, as the man of character that he was, following his demotion, Henry worked even harder to prove his dedication to the American military and his fellow soldiers. He volunteered for dangerous assignments as a runner, and he was even injured by shrapnel on one of these assignments. The injury was even sufficient that Henry could have been medically discharged, but instead of leaving, Henry stayed to fight to continue to prove his loyalty. By November, it was clear to everyone involved that Germany had lost the war. The only thing left to negotiate was the terms to end it. So just after 5 a.m. on November 11th, 1918, German, British, and French officials signed an armistice to end World War I. German officials wanted to halt the fighting immediately to spare any more bloodshed, but the Allied general in charge refused for several reasons. It was decided instead that the fighting would end right at 11 a.m. Just under 6 hours later, at 10:44 a.m., this message was relayed to the 313th Regiment that Henry was a part of. The runner's orders stated that the fighting would stop in exactly 16 minutes. Until then, don't advance any farther and don't relinquish any position. By this time, the front lines were mostly quiet anyway because the message had been passed along to essentially all of the troops. It's thought that as this message made its way through the unit, Henry realized that he had just a few minutes left to prove his loyalty. His unit had just approached a German roadblock protected by manned machine guns, and all of a sudden, Henry took off running towards the roadblock. His unit yelled after him, the German roadblock yelled for him to stop. Then they fired a couple of warning shots, but Henry kept running with his bayonet pointed. Then, as he got too close, a burst of bullets rang out, one of which hit Henry right in the temple. He died instantly, and his body dropped to the ground. The time of his death was 10:59 a.m., just 1 minute before the official end of World War I.
Unlucky
Henry
bastard.
Gunther was officially the last American soldier to be killed in combat in World War I.
Just because he was a...
It's unclear
Dumbass.
exactly whether he was trying to use those last minutes to regain his honor or if he intended for it to be a suicide mission, but unfortunately, it turned out to be both. In retrospect, the 6-hour delay following the armistice seems like a loss of life that could have been avoided. 2,738 troops died during those final hours, and another 11,000 were wounded. The reasons for the delay that I found when researching this story included allowing for time for the message to spread across the lines, wanting to establish specific positions for better negotiating power, and the symbolic value of 11-11-11. After the war, Henry's body was returned to his family in Baltimore, and he was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his heroic actions in the final moments. He was also posthumously
Let's go,
reinstated to the
boy.
position of sergeant.
I guess he did I guess in the end he did make
Royal
up his
families,
losses.
particularly in Europe, did a weird thing during the medieval ages to preserve the royal bloodline. The royal bloodline was possessed by anyone directly related to the family, so naturally, the only way to preserve the bloodline was to marry biologically related relatives. This practice was remarkably common and even continued until relatively recently. For example, Queen Elizabeth II, the current Queen of England, married Prince Philip, who was actually her third cousin. Typically, these marriages were between more distant relatives, but occasionally between not having an available relative or simply not understanding
your
why this
kids
was a
are
problem,
fucking
more closely related individuals married and had children. The worst offenders for this behavior were the infamous Spanish Habsburg family. During their 184 years of rule between 1516 and 1700, 9 of 11 total marriages were incestuous. This even led to the development of the distinctive Habsburg jaw, which was actually a condition known as mandibular prognathism passed from generation to
Bro,
generation.
I know some friends who look
This
like
is where
they're
the lower jaw
fucking
is larger
inbred.
than the upper jaw, causing a large underbite. It can be hard to eat, talk, and even fully close the mouth if it's bad enough. Although the Habsburg officially began ruling in Spain in 1516, they were originally from modern-day Germany and Austria. But from the time that they married into the Spanish royal family, the inbreeding was already significant.
Yeah.
And this situation would only get worse over time. Between 1527 and 1661, this royal family produced a total of 34 children. 30% of these children died before age 1, and 50% before their 10th birthdays. So although they were one of the wealthiest families in the entire world, their infant mortality rate was 10% higher than that of Spanish commoners. Which, by the way, the infant mortality rate was already an insane 20% in the pre-modern medicine era.
Lol.
Ironically, this intermarriage was all done to strengthen lines of succession and political alliances. At the time, royal blood was considered to be substantially different from common blood. In practice, this slowly weakened the royal family and the subsequent generations, eventually culminating in a man known as Charles II, or more infamously, the Bewitched. Born on November 6, 1661, Charles's mother was the niece of his father, and his grandmother was also his aunt. In addition to both of these already disturbing pieces of information, each of those individuals was already part of a long line of inbreeding. To help quantify the level of inbreeding of any one person, there is something called the inbreeding coefficient. The higher the number, the greater the degree of inbreeding. The child of cousins, for example, would have a value of 6.25%. This is compared to that of the average person, which is less than 1%. The first king of Habsburg, so the first to have been married into the royal family in Spain, was only 2.5%. And King Charles II had a value of 25.4%,
Lord,
around
he's half
10
of
times
his-
that of his great-great-great-grandfather. This value is also twice as high as what you'd expect from the uncle-niece marriage of his parents.
Lord.
This is because of all the other inbreeding that had gone on in the generations before that, making each of his parents also more closely related than just uncle-niece.
Yeah.
A value of 25% also happens to be the same as if his parents were brother and sister. And in case you weren't aware, a higher degree of inbreeding leads to significantly higher chances of genetic disorders and other congenital defects. Now, as I often find out